Hello everyone, welcome to this video on how to add a dashboard in Angular with ASP.NET Core in Bold BI. Bold BI, a powerful business intelligence tool, simplifies the process of creating interactive dashboards with a rich set of features. Integrating a dashboard into your Angular application with an ASP.NET Core backend can enhance your user experience with real-time analytics. I've provided a link to the documentation, which includes a sample application for you to refer to as we go along. Let's get started. I've already installed Node.js and the .NET SDK on my machine to create an Angular application with Visual Studio Code. Next, I create a folder for the application and navigate to it. Then, I run this command to create the application. This creates a basic project with all the necessary files and dependencies to get started with building the application. Then I run this command. This package provides JSON serialization and deserialization in .NET applications. It allows for easy conversion between .NET objects and JSON formatting, facilitating data interchanges with web services and APIs. Next, I run the command to add system runtime serialization primitives. This package provides runtime serialization support for various data types, allowing efficient conversion of objects into a format that can easily be stored or transmitted and subsequently deserialized back into their original object form. Next, I need to add an embed config.json file to configure embedding parameters, authentication, user context, and customization for the secure embedding of a dashboard. In the dashboard server, click Settings. Select Embed, and click Enable Embed Authentication. Then click Download. A dialog box will open. I select the Sales category and Sales Analysis dashboard, respectively. Next, I download the JSON file and add it to the application's root folder. I open the application root folder in Visual Studio Code. I create a new folder titled Models. Within it, I create a model class titled dataclass.cs. Then I add the necessary namespaces. This imports libraries that handle JSON serialization, system operations, collection management, link operations, data serialization, and tasks based on asynchronous programming under the Angular Dashboard Viewer Models namespace. Next, I add the Embed class to store the embedding query string and the URL of the dashboard server API respectively for dashboard embedding configurations. I add a token object class to store information related to the response message, status, and token, such as an authentication token. Next, I add a token class for authentication token responses with JSON property annotations to properly map JSON response fields. We'll also add an Embed Details class to configure the dashboard embed details. Next, I create a new file, name it globalappsettings.cs, and add the Global App Settings class to access and manage embedding configurations globally across the application. Next, in the Controllers folder, I create a file called dashboardcontroller.cs. This defines the API to get details of a particular dashboard. Then I add the necessary namespace functions to handle HTTP requests, JSON data, and cryptographic services. To avoid naming conflicts, I add the Angular Dashboard Viewer namespace, and then the API controller as query parameters to define the controller's root. Next, I add the getData method, which reads and returns the contents of the embed config.json file as JSON. I add the getDashboards method, which retrieves a list of dashboards by making an HTTP GET request to a remote API and using a token for authorization. It will return the response content as a string. Next, add the getToken method that generates and returns an access token by sending a POST request with embedded credentials to the Bold BI server. Then I add the authorization server method that generates an embed authorization response by appending user info and a timestamp to the embed query, signing it, and fetching the embed authorization from the dashboard server. I add the getSignature URL method that generates a base 64 encoded HMAC SHA-256 signature for the given query string by using the embed secret. Next, I open the program.cs file and add the newtonsoft.json namespace. Then, I add this code sample before the app map controller's root method. This enables cores for all origins and reads and deserializes the embedconfig.json file into global app settings.embed details. It also sets up a default controller root for the bold BI embed controller. Next, I create a new file and name it package.json. Then I copy the package list from the documentation and add it to the package.json. Next, I open the app.component.ts file in the client app src app folder. Then, I replace the code to define the mandatory properties and invoke the onInit method. Then I open the index.html file. Then I copy this code from the documentation and add it by replacing the existing code. Next, I open the app.component.html file and replace this code with code that contains an element with the class dashboard container. It uses router outlet to dynamically render based on Angular's routing configuration. Next, I open the app.module.ts file and replace it with the following, which will import the necessary modules and components. Then, I create a new file called app.service.ts in the app folder. I add imports to create injectable services, make HTTP requests, handle HTTP parameters and headers, and manage location strategies. Next, I define an injectable Angular service named AppService. It uses HTTP client for making HTTP requests and has private properties for storing API endpoint URLs and headers. I set up the HTTP headers, including cores and an authorization token, for making requests to a specified URL in the application. Then I retrieve data from the specified URL by using an HTTP GET request in the Angular application, applying custom headers and returning the response as an observable stream. I provide the method getEmbedConfig to make an HTTP GET request to get dashboard's URL. Next, I create a new file called app.ts in the client app src app folder. Then I copy the code from the document and add it. I create a new file called dashboard.service.ts in the client app src app folder. Then I copy the code from the document and add it. This defines a service to manage an embeddconfig property, allowing other components and services to get and set the configuration through the getEmbedConfig and setEmbedConfig methods, respectively. Then I create a folder named Dashboard Listing in the Client App src app folder. And I add a file named dashboardlistingcomponent.html. I add div ID viewer section and dashboard. Next, I create a file named dashboardlistingcomponent.ts. In the dashboardlisting.component.ts, I import the necessary modules and services in an Angular component to embed bold BI dashboards and dashboard service for managing dashboard-related logic. Then, I define an Angular component, dashboard listing component, with the selector app dashboard listing, linking to the dashboardlisting.component.html to provide the app service to this component for dependency injection. Next, I define the dashboard and embed config to initialize dashboard's list as an empty array and ensure consistent dependency naming. Then, I fetch the embed configuration, set it via dashboard service, and construct the base and API URLs dynamically based on the environment type. I add getDashboard, which obtains the dashboard list from the server and passes it to the dashboard details, or in a method to render the dashboard. In the render dashboard method, I create an instance to render the dashboard using the load dashboard method. Then pass configuration parameters like the server URL, dashboard ID, and environment, and log the instance to the console. Next, I create a folder named CSS in the Assets folder. Then I create a site.css file in the Assets folder. I copy the styles from the documentation and add them to the CSS file to render the dashboard properly. Now everything is ready to render the dashboard. I run npm install to download the necessary dependencies and packages for the application. Next, I run this command to build and run the application. I copy the URL and run it in a browser, which automatically creates a redirection with a new port number. You'll see the sales analysis dashboard rendered when it loads. If you want to open the dashboard in design mode, change the view mode to design and load dashboard to load designer in the dashboard listing component.ts. And build and run the application. You'll see the dashboard load in design mode. In this video, I've shown you how to embed a dashboard in an Angular application using ASP.NET Core in Bold BI. If you found this video helpful, click the like button and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos like this. Thank you for watching.